Lyza, I'm going to be reading through and talking about your paper one here about vaccinations. Do vaccinations really eradicate diseases? Why was smallpox completely eradicated by its vaccine, but mumps, measles, and rubella have not been eradicated by the MMR vaccine? How did the development of the first vaccine change the practice of medicine in the United States versus other countries? These are all questions that I'm very curious to know as I begin my journey into the profession of medicine. Almost everyone in their lifetimes has received a vaccination, including me. With immunizations being one of the greatest advancements in the history of medicine, it seems fitting to want to understand the influence they have had, as they will be around forever. Well, I mean, we imagine they'll be around forever, but I would just say it seems fitting to understand the influence they have had. I think it's fitting to want to understand it just because it's been such a big influence. I mean, there are things that science are developing that might replace vaccines. Okay, sorry. I, along with many other people, are extremely grateful for vaccinations, but ever since the very first vaccinations were produced, there have been critical attitudes towards them. I know I will always have questions about the validity and effectiveness of vaccines, but I also know they are extremely important for health. It is hard not to be extremely curious about something that's so fascinating and has the ability to save the lives of so many. Okay. One just little tiny thing I was going to point out is when you have up there the United States vs other countries. So like if you were citing a law case, you would have versus abbreviated to VS. But when you're when this is within your sentence and that's not what you're talking about, you should go ahead and write out versus. Generally speaking, you want to write out most things so that in a formal paper, because we perceive it as more formal if you write things all the way out. Okay. After a lot of research into the history of vaccines, I decided to start at the very beginning in order to most accurately influence my opinions. The first article, The History of Vaccines and Immunizations, Familiar Pattern, New Changes, introduces the basis for what started a huge advancement in medicine. In 1796, the very first vaccine was introduced by Edward Jenner to try and combat the smallpox disease. I think we just say combat smallpox. Jenner connected the smallpox disease with cowpox and used pus from a cowpox blister. Oh, I have heard about this before. Which he then ingested into his first experiment patient, an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. Oh, lucky him. Phipps was injected with the smallpox disease in which he went... Phipps was then injected with the smallpox disease in which he went unaffected. I'm not sure what you mean there. And did not contract the disease, meaning Jenner's vaccine was successful. The History of Vaccines and Immunizations is where you got that story from. Yeah, there's something in that last sentence that definitely needs cleaning up, because I think I get what you're saying, but I have to kind of search for it. According to the CDC, in 1980, the World Health Assembly declared smallpox eradicated. This means that the smallpox disease was completely wiped out from the face of the earth. This makes me wonder why all vaccines, historically and currently, do not eradicate diseases like Jenner's did. That's a good question. Another issue of, another like small piddly issue is when you talk about the CDC, the first time. The general rule is, and I'm not so freaked out about it, but the general rule is that the first time you call it by its full name, you call it the Centers for Disease Control, and then after that, you refer to it. Okay, the development of Jenner's first vaccine. Oh, your apostrophes are correct. You don't know how happy that makes English teachers. Okay. It's really dumb, but it makes us happy. The development of Jenner's first vaccine completely changed the practice of medicine and the government's involvement within the medical field. Although at the beginning the government's support regarding vaccines was, quote, uneven and incomplete, over time it changed. Some vaccines, including Jenner's smallpox vaccine, were even made a requirement under the law. Yeah, and I like that. I like the quote that you chose there. Those exact words, uneven and incomplete. I think those are good ones to have chosen to directly quote. Rather than to paraphrase, because they're like really specifically expressing the situation. Government involvement also increased in the 20th century. Okay, so I'm going to go back for a second. So this happened when again? This happened in 1796. So when you talk about governments, you need to be more specific, because since we're in the United States and all that, I kind of assume when you don't mention it that you're talking about the United States. But I mean, the United States in 1796 is definitely still like trying to figure itself out. I'm guessing they, I don't know how they were involved in that, but I'm imagining maybe you're talking about England or countries in Europe at that time. I don't know. Okay, the development of the first vaccine completely changed the practice of medicine and the government's involvement with the medical field. At the beginning, did I read that? Yes, I did. Okay. Government involvement also increased in the 20th century as the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine was developed and soon after required by the government for children to attend public school. Again, I'm assuming you mean the American government. You don't have to say that every time, but like, yeah, I think if that first one you straighten it out, the others, of course, I'll assume that you're talking about the United States. The World Health Organization and the Expanded Program on Immunization were two organizations that helped expand the vaccine program in efforts to increase the amount of people, especially children, who receive necessary vaccines. I do not know why some vaccines are required for certain things and others are not. What puts a vaccine in the category to be required? Although I don't necessarily believe that every single vaccine that has been created should be required by law, I definitely believe that if the disease is severe enough and puts the entire population at risk, it is ethical and responsible to require everyone to receive it. I mean, my understanding is that is kind of the criteria they use, but I'm not an expert in this, as you know. After researching the first ever vaccine, and you wonder about the history of other vaccines. Lovely transition. The measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine came out in 1971 after the 3 individual vaccines were combined. The measles vaccine was first made in 1963, followed by mumps in 1967 and rubella in 1969. The vaccine was declared eliminated from the United States. Wait, what? You mean the disease was declared? And I don't think you just mean the one disease, right? But you mean like the 3 diseases that you're vaccinating for there. There are still outbreaks of measles, mumps, and rubella in the United States, but they're so rare that they are rare, so that is why it is considered eliminated and not eradicated. In my opinion, the MMR vaccine is a vaccine that should be required, because if that were the case, the disease would be eradicated. Okay, so this is another place, like the MMR is eradicating, as you mentioned earlier, 3 separate diseases: measles, mumps, and rubella. So we can't talk about the disease, because it's 3. As I continued to research, I became curious about how the history of vaccinations differed among different countries. Cool. Even before Jenner produced his first ever smallpox vaccination, it was present in Africa. Oh, right, this story. With a man named something. I think you need to capitalize his name the first time you mention him. It was gifted to a white man as a slave and described to his master about the story of his immunity to smallpox. This guy was injected with smallpox pus by a thorn into his arm in order to mildly infect him, boosting his immunity. Apparently, this was a common practice from where he came from and had been for hundreds of years. This means that before any real news of vaccination in England or the States, it had been done for a long time in Africa. It was not... Okay, so actually, stepping back, the guy who did the smallpox vaccine, was he British or American or... Yeah, I think throughout here there's several places you can kind of clarify, because in this part you put England or the States rather than France or the States, or... Yeah, okay, anyway. It had been done for a long time in Africa. It was not accepted by the people of the United States because there was a conspiracy theory that stated... Wow, things change and they stay the same. There was a conspiracy theory that stated the Africans are trying to kill their masters by tricking them into infecting themselves with smallpox. Because of this conspiracy, the inoculation were often banned in many states and were not widely accepted, leading to 2 whole decades passing before an official vaccine for smallpox was produced. Ooh, based on this, I definitely think unofficial vaccinations occurred all over the world many years prior to the first documented vaccine. So interesting. After quite a bit of research, many of my questions about the history of vaccinations have been answered, but it also led me to more curiosity. Initially, I had no idea how long the idea of vaccinations has been around, or even that it was present at all before the first one became official. I also still wonder about what qualifies a vaccine to be required, while others just based on personal choice. So you might go into that in your next paper. The practice of medicine has been around since the beginning of time, which goes to show how important it is in the daily life of everyone. With vaccinations being one of the most important things that exists in the medical field, I find it extremely important to be well educated and well informed on the information that surrounds them. Stronger conclusion than introduction. Though I know introductions are just outrageously difficult. Because, oh, and then look at your works cited. It looks okay. I was going to say, because you have plenty, like you have on to page 4, right? And I believe this is 3 to 4 pages. Let's also go back to your introduction and cut out everything there that you feel like you don't really need. I know introductions are very difficult to write, very difficult. I think they're the hardest part. But I feel like there's definitely some just sort of filler and trying to figure out where you're going with that. So very often introductions need some editing once the whole paper is done. So I hope you found that helpful, and thank you for your paper.